What happens when a libertarian comic, a British intellectual, and Joe Rogan get in a room for 3 hours? You don't get a shouting match, you get something more dangerous, a war of ideas, where history, media, war, and morality all collide. This is the Joe Rogan Experience number 2303 with Dave Smith and Douglas Murray. And this one, it hits different. Joe starts the conversation with something we've all felt. The way media treats serious topics today is broken. Mainstream debates have become a circus, loud, shallow, and all about dunking on the other side. Joe wants something else. He wants depth. He wants clarity. He wants real disagreement without the noise. And in this episode, that's exactly what he gets. Douglas Murray questions whether Joe has unintentionally tilted his guest list toward anti-war critics, especially on issues like Israel and Ukraine. Joe pushes back. He says he just invites people he finds genuinely interesting. Not as a political move, but as a way to explore ideas. But let's be honest, when your podcast is the biggest in the world, the people you give a microphone to shape the public narrative. Whether you like it or not, that's influence. From there, things move to the kind of voices being elevated on platforms like Rogan's, especially ones without formal expertise. Douglas is worried. He calls out people like Daryl Cooper, who, despite not being trained historians, are now seen by many as serious commentators on world events. But Dave Smith doesn't buy the gatekeeping. He argues that you don't need a PhD to notice patterns, to question power, or to research history on your own. And to be honest, he's got a point. Institutional trust has collapsed for a reason. People are tired of being lied to by experts who turn out to be wrong. Still, there's danger in going too far the other way, where I did my own research becomes a license to spread whatever fits your narrative. There's a line. But in this conversation, that line stays blurry. Then Churchill comes up. Murray says there's been a disturbing trend of portraying Churchill as a villain instead of the hero who stood up to Hitler. And yeah, there are people online calling him things like a secret villain of World War II. Smith and Rogan say those comments are meant to be provocative, not literal, just a way to challenge the one-sided storytelling we've been fed. But I get where Murray's coming from. If we keep poking holes in the reputations of historical figures without proper context, we risk flattening everything into black and white, villain or saint. And once you lose historical complexity, you start making really bad comparisons, like when the conversation pivots to Hitler. Murray accuses some modern commentators of downplaying Hitler's anti-Semitism in the 1930s, claiming no serious historian would support such a view. Rogan seems uncertain, but leans toward thinking Murray may be being a little too uncharitable. Smith reminds everyone that the same people being criticized have been clear about condemning the Holocaust and Nazism. The issue isn't about defending evil, it's about examining how it rose in the first place. And that right there is a recurring theme of the episode. Trying to understand how societies break, how bad ideas go mainstream, and how narratives, true or false, spread like wildfire. Douglas sees a danger in letting fringe thinkers rise unchecked. He thinks it leads to normalization of conspiracy theories, of revisionism, of dangerous ideas. Smith agrees that some ideas on the right are flirting with disaster, especially when they're driven by emotional backlash to woke culture. But he draws a hard line. He doesn't think figures like Cooper belong in that category. He sees them as necessary dissent. Joe brings up the root cause of all this distrust: lies from institutions. From COVID to Iraq to the lab leak theory, the public's faith has been shattered, and when people feel lied to, they stop listening to authority altogether. And that's when they start searching for voices who sound honest, even if they're wrong. The conversation eventually moves to Ukraine, and here's where things get even more complicated. Murray says it's simple. Putin invaded. That's the whole story. No excuses. But Smith pushes for nuance. He points to decades of warnings from diplomats and intelligence officials that NATO expansion could provoke a war. He even cites a 2008 memo from then CIA Director William Burns saying Ukraine joining NATO was Russia's red line. It's not that Smith defends Putin. He clearly says the invasion was unjustified. But he questions whether Western policy helped push us toward this outcome. And honestly, it's a fair question. Joe, as usual, plays the middle. He brings up U.S. funding for Ukraine and wonders why we don't scrutinize Russia's corruption with the same intensity. It's a classic Rogan move, zooming out and asking why certain questions are off limits. Things then shift to Gaza, and this is where the episode reaches peak tension. Smith suggests that Israel has in some ways contributed to Hamas's strength, citing instances where Israeli officials allowed funding to flow into Gaza as a way to divide Palestinian leadership. He points to comments by Netanyahu and others who admitted they preferred a divided Palestine over a unified one. Murray's response is immediate and intense. He argues Hamas was elected and that their actions, firing rockets, building tunnels, hiding behind civilians, are what caused Israel's military response in the ongoing blockade. Smith focuses on the suffering in Gaza. He describes the blockade as an open-air prison and argues that while Hamas is a brutal regime, innocent civilians are the ones paying the price. Murray pushes back, saying Hamas is the one using civilians as human shields, building infrastructure under hospitals, and turning war into a PR campaign. At this point, the disagreement is sharp. Both acknowledge the tragedy, but they see responsibility through different lenses. And then comes a heavy point, the civilian toll. Smith brings up the estimates that for every Hamas fighter killed, multiple civilians die. He questions whether that kind of ratio can ever be morally acceptable. Murray insists that it's not about intent, it's about the reality of war. He argues that Israel's goal is not to kill civilians, but to stop Hamas, and that the chaos of urban combat makes these tragedies unavoidable. From here, the episode broadens out again to look at America's role in the Middle East. Smith says the U.S. acts like an empire, toppling regimes, arming rebels, and spending trillions of dollars on wars that make everything worse. He references Libya, Syria, Iraq, all disasters with American fingerprints all over them. Murray argues the opposite. He says America doesn't act like a real empire. It blunders into wars, gets stuck, then leaves a mess behind. He thinks local actors like Iran are way more effective at expanding influence than the U.S. ever was. But Smith isn't having it. He brings up General Wesley Clark's now famous comment about a neocon plan to take out 7 countries and ties it to the idea that U.S. Foreign policy is shaped by long-standing strategic goals, not just humanitarian excuses. That's when things get tense again. Murray warns that when Smith starts listing names like Wolfowitz and Pearl, it can come off like he's echoing old anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish power, even if that's not his intent. Smith strongly rejects that. He says facts are facts, and that avoiding true criticism just because some bad faith actors might misuse it is a kind of censorship. He insists he criticizes everyone, regardless of religion or background. And to be fair, that's true. But Murray's point still holds. Online, perception can matter as much as intent. By the end of the episode, both guests acknowledge that public figures have a responsibility. Words can be twisted, narratives can be hijacked, and the bigger your platform, the more you have to clarify what you really mean. They wrap up with a moment of mutual respect, even after 2 hours of clashing. There's humor, there's appreciation, and there's a shared belief that talking, even if it's messy, is still better than silence. This episode wasn't about who won the argument. It was about how complex these conversations really are. Because when we talk about war, history, identity, and truth, there are no easy answers. Just the hard work of thinking deeply, listening carefully, and staying open, even when it hurts. And that's why this episode matters. Not because it gives you the truth, but because it reminds you how hard truth is to find. So, what do you think? Let me know.